Hello and welcome to On Geopolitics, a podcast from the Centre for Geopolitics at Cambridge, with me, Suzanne Rain, and Professor Ali Ansari. Last week, I did a lot of talking about Russia's border with Norway, so it's Ali's turn this week. We've decided we're going to give an update on the situation in Iran, Iran's place in the world, and Iran's relationship with Russia. So I'm going to ask all the questions, and Ali, who has hopefully
and I'm going to try and answer them
on this subject, is going to try and answer. We talked last time, a little while ago now, Ali, broadly about Iran, but in particular about the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was being negotiated in Vienna last year and has been kind of stuttering on, and now appears to have kind of come to this abrupt impasse. So I'm going to ask again, because I asked this last time and I liked it. What's the state of play with the JCPOA?
Well, that's and it rhymes as well. No, I mean, I think it's effectively comatose, and a number of people have said that. But it's comatose with people wondering whether they should just remove the life support system altogether, because we're not quite sure whether either side, in this case the United States or Iran, have decided to make the decisions that are necessary to move things forward. So we're at the state of play now, where the Europeans, by which I really mean the European Union in terms of Josep Borrell and the External Action Service, have organised for negotiations to move from Vienna to Doha, where the Americans and the Iranians have bilateral talks mediated by the Europeans, in which, sadly, once again, the Americans and the Iranians will not be in the same hotel, but will be shuttled across, with the Europeans going from one hotel to another. I mean, it is quite bizarre, in which at the very least, one can give the semblance there is life still left in this negotiation. But as a number of us predicted, sadly, what happened was basically a restatement of old positions. In fact, the Americans complained that the Iranians had asked for more things outside what the JCPOA offered.
Just to go back, sorry, Ali, I'm interrupting you. So these were the talks in Vienna.
Yes.
Which was the P5+1.
That's right.
So Britain, China, France, Russia, the United States and Germany talking to Iran.
Yes. And they basically stalled in March.
And
they stalled in March for two reasons. I think the explicit one being the Russians had basically put in some extra demands which weren't going to work. And a lot of even some Iranians privately thought that the Russians had basically put a spanner in the work. But then that was redefined in a way to take the blame away from the Russians and to say that essentially the problem was that the Americans were being quite stubborn about lifting the foreign terrorist organization designation from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the Iranians wanted that lifted. And that seems to have been really a somewhat late gambit in some ways. I don't think it was actually essential. It wasn't central to the whole process. In fact, everything else had been agreed. But this has now become a red line for the Iranians. So that whole process came to a stuttering halt. Obviously, we've had the war in Ukraine. The Russians are no longer really welcome in the room. And so the Europeans, the European Union in this sense, desperate to keep things alive, have now shifted this discussion, to Doha, where it's become bilateral. I mean, the Europeans are not there. The Germans, the French and the British are not there. Neither are the Chinese, for that matter, or the Russians. And interesting, I mean, I suppose this is the interesting thing that came out of the negotiations, was that the next day, the Iranian negotiator, Bagheri Khani, flew off to Moscow to give a report, which even surprised some Iranians, it has to be said. They said the negotiators returned home, except our one went to Moscow. So people are saying he was off to report. And again, it's a very telling indication of what the state of play is in that sense, in terms of also the relationship between Russia and Iran.
So what's basically happened is that they've all worked out that now that Russia's invaded Ukraine, the P5+1 doesn't really function as a group. But
it's difficult. Yes, it's difficult because of what's going on. Yeah, I mean, it is difficult.
And therefore, the only way for any kind of conversation to keep going is if it's between America and Iran, and the EU has some sort of mediatory role, because somehow
I mean, the core of the issue has been between the United States and Iran. I mean, that is the core of the issue. What happened was, with the invasion of Ukraine, is that the Russians added layers to this negotiation, because, of course, the Russians became sanctioned. And because the Russians were sanctioned, it suddenly occurred to them that they can't gain any benefit from sanctions being lifted off Iran. So the idea was, ultimately, or previously, was that the sanctions would be lifted off Iran, there would be a restoration of trade, and the Russians would make great commercial advantage out of this. Now they're suddenly deprived of this. They basically don't want that to happen. And there's an added element, of course, where people are saying that the Russians have been deliberately quite obstructive because they don't want the Iranians to occupy the space vacated by them in the sale of oil. Now, I don't know how true that is, but certainly on social media and other places in discussions in Iran, there is this sort of view that the Russians have deliberately sabotaged it because they don't want the Iranians to occupy the space vacated by the Russians. And Borrell made some play on this, by the way. He sort of said, of course, JCPOA will be agreed. The Iranians can return to the oil market. It will alleviate some of the stress on oil prices, so on and so forth. But of course, that it didn't really reflect the reality of what's going on both in Iran or in the United States, with also the practicalities of doing that in short order.
Ali, now I've got two questions.
Sure.
And what you're talking about is Russia thwarting negotiations in its own interests. But that description that you've given isn't clearly, i.e. not clearly enough, in Iran's interest, because what you're saying is Russia doesn't want them to do a deal because that will benefit Iran.
Yes.
So,
well, this is the question. I mean, it's an enormous paradox.
So is this then about Iran's position? And presumably it is. And we're going to talk a little bit about Raisi, who's been in power now for a year. And clearly things aren't going as smoothly as he would have liked on that front. As he came to power promising to lift sanctions, boost employment, stamp out corruption.
Yeah, well, they all do, don't
stability. Yeah.
I mean, they all do. It's like a politician's wish list, isn't it? I mean, yeah.
But so how does his position, and I understand this to be a weaker position 1 year on because he hasn't delivered all the things he said he was going to do. How does that play into what Iran is hoping to get out of the negotiations with the Americans, or not?
Well, I mean, this is the paradox. So if you were to take any rational assessment of what is in Iran's national interests, it would seem a no-brainer really to say, we have a gap in the market here, which Iran could fill. Now, if you were to listen to the comments that former Foreign Minister Zarif said, for instance, former Foreign Minister Zarif in leaked comments, I said audio comments, he was doing a sort of an oral history, and it obviously wasn't meant to come out, basically said that the Russians had no interest in Iran re-entering the oil and gas market, had no interest in Iran basically securing a share of that market for themselves, and had always tried to block it, had always done work to sabotage. Now, of course, the Russians would deny that and say that's clearly not true and so on and so forth, but there is certainly a sense in Iran among a certain part of the bureaucracy, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and others, that the Russians have not been helpful. Where the ties that bind actually really lie at a different level. And that's really to do with a sort of a mafia military sort of complex, if I can call it that, between the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Supreme Leader's sort of office, which effectively acts as a court. It's almost like a court, a modern court, and the Russians. So the Russians maintain that sort of relationship. And there is a fairly tight commercial relationship there. Now, it's not in Iran's interests, but it seems to be in the IRGC's interests. So that's one thing. And then, of course, both sides seem to share, as Putin has outlined, and so has Lavrov actually, they seem to share a shared vision of what the world will look like in several years' time. And they both believe, and they're very convinced by it, that the West is in decline, the future belongs to them, they will reorder the international order, along with China, probably, and that really they just need to sit it out and wait for it, and obviously all these bounteous goodies will come to them in due course. It is predicated on that, and therefore the Iranians have, certainly from that sort of deep state look, that IRGC look, have doubled down on their relationship with Russia, even though, as you quite rightly say, and in the eyes of many people, in Iran itself, what Iran has to sacrifice in order to pursue this is actually things that we would consider to be in its own national, economic interest.
Okay, so we've got the power, what did you call it? The military mafia complex.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's Raisi, which we can...
Yes. And then, can I just ask you about building a nuclear bomb question?
Yeah.
Because what we always used
to say... Not that I'm an authority on this, by the way, Suzanne. But anyway.
No, I know. But it always used to be this amount, they would say... We need to make sure that something called breakout time is over a certain amount of time. It's got to be that it's going to take Iran a year to build a nuclear bomb with what they've got. And as I understand it, the problem has been that since Trump pulled America out of the JCPOA, the Iranians have been enriching uranium at huge pace and now have significant quantities. And I think the Israelis are saying it would take them basically no time at all, should they decide to do it, to move towards construction of a nuclear bomb such that they would, I mean, whether they'd be able to make it work or not, I don't know. But basically, they've reached the point where talking about breakout time is irrelevant because they could do it tomorrow if they wanted to. Is that where we are? And given what we've all now learnt about the war in Ukraine, which is essentially any country that wants to be able to protect itself from invasion has to have nuclear weapons. And you've had this very widely rippling argument that says this is the key thing against disarmament. Why on earth would we disarm? So given all of that, what do you think? There's obviously an incentive for the Iranians to just carry on enriching the uranium and building the bombs, isn't there?
I mean, there is on that level, yes, there is an incentive. And of course, some of them have taken that lesson from the Ukraine war. Not helped, it has to be said, by the Ukrainian ambassador to London, who actually made this argument himself. He said, if you want to protect yourself, don't give up your nuclear weapons. And of course, some of them will do that. I think the issue here is the technical expertise required, not only just to build the bomb, but to have a means of delivering it. And if we set a dirty bomb aside for the time being, which of course also is an issue, but the fact is that I think there is an interest of certain groups, including the Israelis and others, I mean, even those securing an agreement to sort of say that Iran's breakout time is so short now that we must urgently move on certain things. I think it's also a case, and some other people have argued that, of course, yes, that's a very crude way of assessing Iran's breakout time, but of course it would need to test things. It would need to see that the thing worked. And of course, the minute they went into that sort of stage, we would know about it. I mean, we would be very aware of it. And the question is whether the Iranians want to take that risk. For them, and this is I suppose, an interesting argument to look at it. For the Iranians, I've always felt the nuclear program has two values. One is that I think they've always seen it as something of enormous economic benefit to them. They wanted a nuclear industry. They talk about, exporting enriched uranium. I mean, all sorts of nonsensical things, to be honest, but that's the way that they have viewed it. They viewed it as a sort of a means of economic sovereignty. But the other thing I think they found is that it's very good for leverage. Gets all of us in the West very hot under the collar, and they can extract things, a bit like this hostage policy that they have. They abduct people. The trouble is that it's the threat of doing that gives them leverage. If they actually take the next step and build a bomb for the sake of argument, they've sort of lost that leverage. I mean, it's not. So I've always had a certain amount of skepticism, if you will, about, what their agenda is. I don't think it's necessarily something that we can be too sanguine about, obviously, but it's something that I think is probably warrants a little bit more investigation as to how long it would take them to do, whether they would do it, but also whether, when they talk about a 2-week breakout time, for instance, what does that mean in practice? I don't think it means that they're suddenly going to be nuclear armed in a scale that, nobody in the West is going to be able to respond, or certainly the Israelis. But, as you surmise, it's not the best situation to be in. So it's not something that we should be complacent about by any stretch of the imagination. But
that's interesting, because I'm thinking, would I rather have the leverage, which was me threatening to do something, or would I rather just do it?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, but that's the point. I think if you're thinking about it, yeah. I mean, the point is I think that the threat for them, the fact that they continue on these negotiations, the fact that they like to negotiate, the fact that for them it's important to be seen as part of this very important club. And if, for the sake of argument, the West was to ignore them, as in a way is what's happened, you see, after the war in Ukraine, they've suddenly gone down the scale of priorities somewhat, and they're no longer as important as they thought they were. And that itself is causing them a certain number of problems.
And you have got reports, on Reuters from American officials just saying prospects for a deal after Doha are worse than they were before Doha, and they will be getting worse by the day. So there's no.
Well, they're bound to. No, they're bound to. But they're bound to because the Iranians have taken so long. I mean, if they'd signed this agreement last year, when Raisi came in, let's go to Raisi. When Raisi came in, he dithered. I mean, he dithered in a way that, in some ways, is understandable. He said, as a new administration, we need to come in and master the brief. But they took a long time to master the brief and get going. But they were trying to echo the Americans. They said, well, when Biden came in, it took him an awful long time and blah, blah. So we're going to take a long time too. A lot of the basic format of the agreement was ready in August, but they decided to delay. They spent the better part to the end of the calendar year just going over old ground and gibbering on. In January, they finally got to the stage, of course, of really overcoming some of these obstacles. But then they did it again. And people said, this problem on Ukraine, Russia is going to be quite serious. You ought to really get this agreed now before the geopolitical situation changes. And they took the fateful decision of saying, no, this will strengthen our hand, you see, because Russia's invasion of Ukraine will show how weak the West is, and monumental miscalculation, and now we're stuck. And so the interesting thing is the agreement that we have now on the table is basically the same agreement we had last August, but the geopolitical situation has changed. And because it's changed and Biden has no political capital to spend on Iran, he's just not interested. I mean, it's not worth him doing it.
So is that good for Raisi or bad for Raisi?
I think it's terrible for Raisi in a way. I mean, but I mean, at the end of the day, also, it's not really Raisi. You said that, he'd come into power last year. I think he'd come into office last year. I don't think he has a huge amount of power. He's basically a technocrat. And, he comes up with all the flannel that all these politicians do anyway. We're going to cut corruption and all this sort of thing. I never do it. Even the latest polls, even if you accept polls in Iran, are so low. I mean, his standing is so low that people just don't believe he can deliver.
And that's interesting, Ali, because last time we were talking about this, you and I think I was musing in a way just to get you to tell me I'm wrong again. But wasn't there talk about him being lined up as possible
leader
candidate? Yes.
Yeah, and I said no.
Yes. So you still think no, and even more
strongly?
No, is that
no. I mean, at the time, and I've said this before. I mean, I think that the person being lined up to be the successor to Khamenei is his son. I think Raisi is a stalking horse in that sense. And for me, this has basically just proved it. I mean, basically, he's been brought there as someone that we can all talk about, but actually, he's a disaster. And I mean, I had said last year that he's a bit. I mean, he can't read an auto cue very well, so he's not. He basically does as he's told. He's not a great charismatic. He's not an orator. So it's what's very interesting is that successive people come in. I mean, we see this, and it's not unique to Iran, of course, and they all think they can do things better. I think the problem with Raisi is that he's so bad that people hadn't really quite understood how bad he was in terms of being able to manage government and all the difficulties that are entailed in that. But, the power is not with him anyway. I mean, the power resides really deeper with the court, and that's the Supreme Leader's house. But it doesn't look good for him, I don't think. I mean, he just does what he's told.
And it's the economics, which is really what's driving
It's the economics, it's the politics. They're now tying up, they're trying to be stricter on even social strictures. They're now trying to reinstate a harsher view of the veil, for instance, is now being reimposed again. I mean, there's all sorts of things that are going on. Along with this sort of doubling down with a relationship with Russia, which simply isn't popular among Iranians. I mean, Iranians don't like the Russians really any more than they like it, but they always see the Russians as the sort of bully boys of the region. And there was a very interesting interview done recently by the daughter of one of the former presidents of Iran, Rafsanjani, Faiza Hashemi. And of course, she's been arrested as a result of this. So it's not like there's free speech here. But she said that, we always used to be opposed to Israel because we saw Israel as an occupying power who oppressed and shot Palestinians, the natives of that land. But now we're supporting Russia. And what are the Russians doing? They're occupying someone else's land and shooting the inhabitants. He said, so on what basis can we be opposed to Israel? She said, as far as I'm concerned, we should stop being such hypocrites. Now, of course, it's something that I think reflects wider views in Iran, that this notion that somehow the Islamic Revolution and the Islamic Republic was some sort of moral force for good in the world. Even the most diehard revolutionaries are now saying this is a joke, and that what the Russians have done have exposed this huge hypocrisy.
So this is fascinating, Ali, and this is the cue for me to ask you why Russia hasn't been regarded. I mean, I suppose there's a simple answer to this, which is that your enemy's enemy is your friend. So Russia and Iran are both anti the US, so that's the natural alliance. But I would like you now to explain historically why it is that Britain always gets it in the neck from Iran for our past interference in their territory, and Russia seems to have got away with it, or at least is somehow not vilified in the way that Britain is.
Well, part of it is as you've said, I think it's just geopolitical reality that following the fall of the Soviet Union, first of all, Russia no longer had a border with Iran. It no longer was seen as a direct threat in that sense. But they also shared increasingly a very, very strong anti-Western bias. So there was a coincidence of interest there. What I suppose is more interesting is the fact that, historically speaking, even when they did share a sort of border, I mean, the fact is that the Russians, or either in their imperial or Soviet guise, have probably done more harm to Iranian sovereignty than the Americans or the British could ever do. And yet somehow they're not vilified, as you quite rightly say, in quite the same way as the British are. The British are seen particularly, and it's very interesting if you look at Russian rhetoric, by the way, at the moment. Who are they targeting? It's the British, not the Americans, it's the British. So, somehow, obviously, the British have this extraordinary Machiavellian cunning, which I'm sure...
If only we
country,
actually did.
I know. I'm sure people in this country
brilliant.
would be amazed. I mean, absolutely amazed at how efficient, the British government is. I mean, it's astonishing. And I do say to people, I say, you ought to go and visit Iran and stuff. You'll be mightily impressed by how efficient the British government is. But in any case, why is this? I think part of it, as you say, just to recap, is that notion of geopolitical realities. I think the other thing is basically because many of the sort of histories written, the more popular histories written in Iran in the 20th century came from the left. And because they came from the left, they had an inherent sympathy with the Soviet Union in that sense. It sort of seemed to be the right side of history. Whereas the Britain and the United States, but Britain in particular, was seen as that hub of capitalism and imperialism. I mean, it's amazing for me that the Russians have never been described as imperialist, whereas in actual fact, for much of the 19th century, and I would say also in the Soviet Union, they were the quintessential imperialists, I mean, in terms of what they were doing. And of course, if you look at historically speaking, in the 19th century, the Russians were by far the most powerful country as far as Iran was concerned. They stripped the country of territories in the Caucasus. They tried to seize Iran and Azerbaijan after the Second World War. The relationships were extremely tense. One development which I always like to remind my American colleagues about is that the first embassy to be ransacked by the Iranians was the Russian embassy in 1829. And not only did they ransack it, but they killed everyone in it. I mean, it was a major disaster, political and diplomatic fiasco. But interestingly,
in Tehran.
Yes. So basically, just a quick recap for our listeners here. So basically, there's two wars with Russia at the early part of the 19th century. The second one ends in 1828. It results in this treaty called the Treaty of Turkmenchai. And the Iranians always talk about the Treaty of Turkmenchai. It's a great moment of deep humiliation for them. Not only did it basically confirm the decline of Iran as a great power, removed the Caucasian territories, but it gave the Russians certain extraterritorial rights in Iran. And it also allowed them the establishment of this very lavish embassy, same embassy as you get now. And what the then ambassador was a literary gentleman, actually. He was an author, Griboyedov, who basically came and he was rather arrogant in his dealing with the Persians. I mean, he was a bit pompous about it. One of the things was about the repatriation of all Russian prisoners of war, even those who didn't want to get repatriated by them. And this is the interesting, yeah. So even those who'd settled in there and married, Iranian wives and whatever they were, but the Russians said, no, they were going to come back. This whole thing became quite a scandal, particularly when some of the women folk were sort of taken out and said, you must all return back to, Russia. And of course, some more voluble clerics declared, this was a sacrilegious, and the embassy was ransacked and everyone was murdered. The Iranians sent an absolutely groveling embassy, obviously, to St. Petersburg because they were terrified that, what the consequences might be. And here's the fascinating thing. The Tsar wasn't interested. He thought Griboyedov was a bit of a pain, actually. So he was quite happy with the whole, and, he took the apology in good stead. He was more interested in Poland or Eastern Europe at the time. And so basically, because it had occurred in 1829 and we don't have any mass media and there's no sort of public opinion and whatever, the Russians basically brushed it all off. Certainly the Tsar basically brushed it all off. He took the apology in good faith, and the Iranians, in some ways, the Iranian state was able to effectively not get away with it, but certainly not be punished any further. So
but the border stayed where...
Yes,
where
they
the
didn't take more, but
it.
you see the Treaty of Turkmenchai resulted in a huge reparations. The border was basically Armenia, Georgia, what is now Azerbaijan, were basically permanently ceded to the Russian Empire. But then, the Russians were very active in penetrating, basically influencing Iran for much of the 19th century. And while the British were always seen as interfering, which of course they did at times. But the fact is the British were always on the strategic defensive as far as the Russians were concerned. I mean, for the British, the defense of India was paramount. They just simply didn't want Iran to become a Russian colony, effectively, or a vassal state. Not great result for the Iranians, I have to say, because very often the British probably didn't do enough really to keep the Russians out. But the fact is, it's in the popular imagination in Iran, the Russians are viewed with deep suspicion. Deep suspicion. I remember, and I'll tell you this little anecdote. After the Second World War, Stalin had apparently sent a message to the Iranian Armenians, those who lived, Armenians who lived in Iran. And he said, you should all come back and rebuild your country. And a number of Armenians said, well, we should wonder whether we should take this up. I mean, should we trust Stalin at his word? Should we go back to Armenia or not? And a couple of them said, well, we will go. Let's be the vanguard. Two of us will go back and see what the situation is. Said, we'll go back and we'll send a picture. And if we're standing up, it's okay, come. If we're sitting on chairs, don't come. It's terrible. And when the pictures came back, they were all lying on their backs on the floor. Don't come, Anyway, that sort of image of Russia as this highly oppressive dictatorial regime, while it had a certain amount of sort of traction with some members of the elite who sort of worked with the Russians, the fact is, in a popular sense, because the Russians were opposed to any form of democratic or constitutional development in Iran, they became deeply unpopular. So it's very striking. I mean, what you're seeing now is really, I think, an anomaly for certainly the modern period. Certainly an anomaly that a state should double down so closely with the Russians, given the fact that for many, many Iranians, including officials, by the way, I'm not just saying in the street, but many officials have a deep distrust for that country and see the country as really the source of many of the evils in Iran. It's an interesting gamble, I think, that the regime has taken.
So I'm going to bring you onto that, Ali, because it's interesting actually, because we talk about how we all perceive each other. I think I'm very aware that the Iranians perceive the UK as these arch evil villain characters. You're saying they think the same way about Russia, but of course we see Iran as being the master strategist, the chess player who can outwit everyone. And you wonder then, what's their master strategy here? Because it does seem that what they're all doing is basically quite instinctive, which is, well, now we've all been sanctioned. We don't really like the world order as it currently is. We're fed up of being told what to do by Britain and the US and the EU and the United Nations. So let's come up with our own world order. And that appears to be the thing that's building. So I wanted to ask you a specific question, which I don't know whether you're going to know the answer or not, but I've been seeing quite a few things online about Russia trying to export grain to Syria and trade links that Russia is building with like-minded countries. And I wanted to ask you, so for me, again, you need the map, but basically there's a line that you can draw, which is the north-south transport corridor, which apparently Russia and Iran are talking about, which is going to take Russian goods by rail due south, really, to Astrakhan, and then across the Caspian Sea by freighter to Bandar Ansari.
Ansari.
And then over Iran by truck to Bandar Abbas, and then onward to India or to China or wherever by sea. And so that's the proposed new route for the like-minded.
So just to remind me, so you're saying basically they would go from, where would it be from?
Well, St. Petersburg. So
St. Petersburg down, and then go across the Caspian Sea to Bandar Anzali, and then by truck down to Bandar Abbas.
Yes, and then load onto boats again.
This is such a nonsensical route. I mean,
But it's direct. If you draw a line, you can actually just draw.
Yeah, but there are two rather large mountain ranges. I mean, it's the original idea, as I understand it, was to have a sort of a rail link that would have gone through, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, through eastern Iran, down to Bandar Abbas, straight down. I mean, to go across the Caspian to Bandar Anzali and then down through that way is an incredibly laborious process, and it really for it to be meaningful, it really needs to be either some sort of super highway, or it needs to be a railway. And at the moment, first of all, let me just be clear, these sort of discussions have been going on for decades. I mean, they've been going on for decades and nothing's actually happened. So I wouldn't hold your breath. It's a nice idea, but I can't see it happening. The other thing is, when they were talking about the Belt and Road Initiative and actually connecting Iran vis-a-vis a sort of a railway from China all the way, then it would go up through to St. Petersburg. Through the Caucasus. The fact is, disputes along the way have ensured that actually parts of the line haven't been built, even though people are still away, and there are some real oddities there. But the other thing, which is really quite extraordinary, is this is a single railway line. It's not even a dual track. I mean, so basically, if a train's going one way, I mean, that's it, basically. I mean, and I remember talking to some Iranians about this. I said, why are you just building and they, it seemed to me, really discussing it with them, that this was more a good idea rather than something that was seriously being invested in as a sort of a means of it. It was really a talking point. Because I think in theory, of course, what you say is absolutely right. I mean, in theory, it would be a fantastic Eurasian network in a sense, an economic link. But it is remarkable to me how little they've progressed this.
According to whatever I was reading, some maritime
Yeah.
newspaper, they are going to try a test shipment of 2 containers of Russian plywood from St.
Brilliant.
Petersburg
heading
to Astrakhan and then further down. And that they think the overall voyage is going to take 25 days. So still quite...
I mean, those two, that will be, yes. Well,
so we'll see where they go.
Let's see where that happens.
And then this broader question about grains and harvests and how they might be distributed now that the EU have sanctioned and closed Russian ports. And here, Mohammad Reza Mortazavi, who's head of Iran's Food Industries Associations, has said that Iran is discussing the transit of grains from Russia to the Persian Gulf and other countries. So the question is, can Iran help Russia with this problem?
It can, but I don't think it will, if I can put it that way.
Okay.
Yeah, and even if there are huge opportunities here, I think, for the Iranians to play a very, very interesting role. But if history is anything to go by, again, as I said, I wouldn't hold your breath. And the thing is, Iranian officials are in the habit of talking a lot. I mean, of saying we're discussing this, we're doing this, we've got great plans, but none of them ever bear any fruit. So okay. I wouldn't. I honestly, I'm sorry to pour cold water on this.
Good, because that's exactly what he said it is going to do. He says that Iran, Russia and Kazakhstan could barter wheat and grains with other products such as vegetables, fruits and dairy.
But this is the thing. If you notice, he says could. See that? There's always a conditionality. We could. We are discussing. We might. I always remember an Iranian tourist minister saying Iran could have an international tourist industry worth $20 billion a year. Yes, Iran could, but it would have to change certain aspects of its domestic politics before Western tourists set into Iran on the scale that they think they would. I mean, they simply wouldn't. So, I mean, there's all sorts of things about that. Again, I mean, I'm open to persuasion. I mean, if you see anything, Suzanne, I mean, if you see these things developing, if you see that shipment of plywood going through, then we can revise our assessments. But I can't see it happening. Sadly.
Great, Ali. No, that's really helpful and really clear. And my role is simply to ask the ridiculous questions to enable you to shine with your knowledge. So now we're going to draw to a close by looking a little bit into the future and saying, so what you've described is a relationship which is pragmatic, but not based on a lot of trust. And actually, 2 countries with their own problems, which means that a lot of the things they might say they might do might actually never happen. What do you think is going to happen next, I suppose, in respect of the Iran-Russia relationship, but actually just in respect of Iran as well? Because none of this looks particularly good, does it?
Well, I think the Iranians will sort of muddle along. They're probably selling enough oil to the Chinese at the moment to keep themselves afloat. Their view is, I mean, a lot will depend what happens in Ukraine. I mean, their view is the Russians will win. Let's be honest about it. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. I know, obviously the Russians are doing as well as they thought they might be doing, but I don't think they're losing at the moment. And the question is whether, who loses interest first. It's a classic Iranian strategy, of course. They're going to say, we'll wait it out. The West will lose interest. Ukraine will be dumped and it will show that, the Russians are still in the driving seat. And so I think, we'll have to wait and see what happens on that broader front. But as far as I'm concerned, I mean, even if for the sake of argument, we get to an agreement and on the JCPOA tomorrow, the next day, whatever, next week, the fact is we've got the US midterms coming up in November. That's unlikely to be very good for Biden. Then basically the sunset clauses are going to be kicking in anyway. I mean, that's part of the silliness, I think, of the current negotiations was to get obviously things back on an even keel. But the longer you leave it, the less attractive that even keel becomes, because obviously the sunset clauses are going to kick in. So basically what would happen is you'd have to then get to the next stage, you'd have to negotiate again for the longer and stronger, which is what, of course, the Americans wanted in the first place, which the Iranians refused. So whether there's the political will left in the United States and in the European countries, to be honest, to engage in yet more discussions with the Iranians is a matter of debate. I think if the Iranians came over with some serious proposals, and this would reflect maybe the difficulties they might find in their economic situation, their political situation, then I don't think anyone is going to be opposed to talks. But I think the barrier, in a sense, that sort of to get any enthusiasm back in the US and European negotiating teams, I think the barrier is much higher now. I mean, people will say, well, we need to see some concrete results of something going on.
So Iran would have to come and say, we've decided we do want to have these negotiations.
Yes. And we've decided that, we will make the following concessions, but this is what we want. But we won't. I mean, what I understood from the Doha round was the Iranians came in with all sorts of other demands, but with no new concessions. So, I mean, it just wasn't going to work. And until they're serious about that, I can't see anyone in the West wanting to sort of get out of bed, really, to go and sit in a room with the Iranians for 8 hours or 10 hours just to get back to square one again.
It seems to me that a likely next phase is the drawing closer of Iran, China and Russia. And so I think Iran is now part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
As an observer, yeah.
So these sort of things, the more the West relies on sanctions to solve problems, the greater the number of people in the sanctioned club.
Yeah,
there's a risk of an unintended consequence here, which is that they think, well, if we're all sanctioned, let's find it. We don't need SWIFT anymore because we can have our own way of doing it. And then suddenly they don't want to negotiate.
But it's like a new Iron Curtain, isn't it? I mean, it's like they'll be behind the Iron Curtain and they'll have their own economic ecosystem basically for themselves. The difficulty here, I think, for the Iranians is simply this: is that the Iranian economy is in such bad shape that, if they were to get into some sort of like binding relationship with China, for instance, which is, one of these things, the agreement, they had a 25-year agreement, a strategic economic agreement with the Chinese. A lot of Iranians are very concerned that will basically turn Iran into some sort of economic colony of the Chinese, which in pure financial terms, it would. I mean, because basically, for instance, one of the things in this agreement is that there'll be collaboration between Chinese and Iranian banks. But of course, Iranian banks are bankrupt. So it's not really going to be a collaboration, really. I mean, it's going to be basically a Chinese buyout. So, it's not and the Iranians are aware of that. I mean, they sort of look at that and they sort of say, this is not exactly a partnership of equals. So I think there are domestic issues that I think we also need to be aware of, which I think could also, make the relationship could probably be a little bit more difficult to forge, let's put it that way, because I don't think Iranians themselves are going to be very happy with that. And, I was reminded by that Russian comment that the only people more mendacious than us are the Iranians. I mean, if that's the basis of your friendship, it's not a great basis. I mean, if basically they're saying that, we love the Iranians because they're bigger liars than we are.
What was the other proverb that I used to hear? A jackal of Mazandaran cannot be caught but by a jackal of Mazandaran.
Oh, really? I haven't heard that one. That's a good one. We should probably end on that. We should end on that, Suzanne.
Let's end on that.
That's a brilliant one.
Difficult to understand warning proverb. Ali, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Magisterial. I'm not either reassured or more gloomy, actually, because I think it's just a continuation of the gloom, isn't it? Really. So there's nothing really to be. You're right. I mean, it's a muddle. It's a muddling situation, isn't it? It's a muddling situation which we must continue to monitor, because I think you're right. We've reached all sorts of impasses here, but there's going to have to be some change at some point.
Yeah.
And maybe something good will happen. It's unlikely, but let's keep an open mind. So thank you very much, Ali, and thank you, audience. For being
we'll talk next time. We're looking forward. We're doing more Russia, aren't we? I think, if I'm not mistaken.
We're going to have Natasha Kurt from King's College London talking about Russia and China on the far eastern border in a couple of weeks' time. So it'll be fun.
Excellent.
Thank you.